Hi everyone, welcome to this next in a series of videos about English Language Paper 1. In this video I'm going to do a walkthrough of question 2 of the paper, starting with what it is that you're required to do for the question and showing you a few tips and tricks for maximising your marks in terms of timing and in terms of how to approach this text. Towards the end of the video, I'm also going to go through a few example answers and talk about what makes them either very good or maybe not so good examples of answers to a question 2 for this paper. If you haven't already, I would strongly advise having a watch of the video that explains the assessment objectives for this exam, as well as the video that walks through paper 1 and question 1, so that you are up to speed with everything that I'm talking about. Right, let's get started and have a look at question 2 then. I would aim to spend no more than 10 minutes on this question. It is very, very easy to get bogged down in question 2 and to spend a lot longer than 10 minutes, but it is only worth a maximum of 8 marks and no more. So even if you write an absolutely phenomenal answer that is worth 35 marks, you will only get a maximum of 8. And it's worth bearing that in mind because it's still one of the early questions on the paper, so you want to try and bank the marks and move on. Again, do remember that in section A you still have that big 20 marker in question 4 coming up, so you don't want to erode away your time for that by spending too long on a relatively straightforward question. The reason that it's so easy to spend too long on question 2 is because this is the question that should feel the most familiar to you. It's assessing the skill that you have been practicing probably since your very earliest days in the English classroom, and that is looking at the effect that's created by a writer's choice of language. So this is certainly something that we do as early as year 7, and I'm sure you do very similar things even earlier than that in primary school. It's one of the first things we do when we learn how to read at more than just a very basic level, is we start thinking about what is the character thinking there? Why are they thinking that? What is the significance of that particular setting? And because of that, this should feel, like I say, very familiar. It's also worth noting that AO2 is exactly the same for English language and for English literature. So it is a skill that you get a lot of practice in the lead up to your GCSEs, because it's the same skill that you'd be applying to your 19th century novel or to your modern text and to your Shakespeare as well. So, and the poetry, of course. Everything that you do in English literature here in terms of looking at how the writer creates mood or feeling for the reader, or how the writer presents a character or a place, it's exactly the same. The only difference here is that you're looking at that piece of unseen fiction again. Question 2 asks you to comment on how the writer has used language to shape meaning and create effect for the reader. And that's essentially looking at their choice of words, phrases and devices in order to make us think or feel a specific way when we read those words, phrases or devices. And this is where your initial highlighting comes in. So if you've read the extract carefully and you have annotated something on there already, even if you haven't annotated, to be honest, if you have simply read and understood it and zoomed in on particular features, those features are going to come in really handy now. Always use what you've already got and try not to double up on the workload wherever you can. It's all about saving time and taking shortcuts to maximising your marks here. Right, so I do explain the assessment objectives in a lot more detail in my video on the GCSE assessment objectives for English language. However, I thought it would be worthwhile just going through some of the more question-specific details in this video. This is what it says in the specification regarding Assessment Objective 2. Students are required to explain, comment on and analyse how writers use language and structure to achieve effects and influence readers, using relevant subject terminology to support their views. Now the key words here in this are explain, comment on, analyse, language. We're going to ignore structure for now because that half of AO2 is assessed in question 3, so we're just going to focus on language. We are looking at how it achieves effects, and we're also looking at the relevant subject terminology. breaking that down to what it actually means or what it looks like in question 2. When you're explaining what you mean, you are putting things into your own words, you're synthesizing that information and reproducing it in your own way. It's one of the best ways to show understanding of a text is to take the information and translate it in some way, either by summarizing or rephrasing it. In order to comment on a text, you have to draw inferences or form an opinion, response, or interpretation to it. So being able to draw an inference or comment on possible meanings of words, phrases, and devices is where you're going to pick up the marks here, rather than just saying, it says this in the text. Being able to say, it says this in the text, which makes me think, or which suggests, and we'll go through some examples of what that looks like in student writing in a moment. Analysis is all about showing you understand by exploring or unpicking. This is the bit that where I talk about zooming in on a specific word or zooming in on a specific feature, especially if you're using longer quotes. I would always encourage you to try and use shorter quotes where possible because it saves you time and it shows that you're being more judicious in your choices. However, if you're using a longer quote, being able to zoom in on which individual words or which individual parts of that quote create the inference or the opinion that you've already referred to, that's where you're going to pick up the marks for analysis. And of course, this is a language-focused question, so that means looking at words and phrases and language devices in particular. It does also mean looking at sentence structure and narrative structure, although I would say just be careful about these last two. As I've said before, this is a language-focused question, not a structural-focused question. And although it is relevant to comment on the writer's use of sentence structure or narrative structure, for a question 2, you really need to be doing that in terms of how they convey meaning or how they describe something or how those sentence structures help to support the connotation that's being built up here, or how the narrative structure adds to the idea that or the motif that the writer keeps coming back to. When I look at question 3 with you guys, I will explain how that looks different in a structure question. In essence, language is looking at meanings and connotations and ideas, and structure is looking at whole text. It's looking at what is happening in the text and why the writer has chosen to put certain things in a certain order in order to keep the reader engaged with what they are reading. But try not to worry about it too much. The easiest way to approach language in question 2 is to focus on those words, phrases, and language devices. So if that's something you're not 100% certain of, then stick to words, phrases, and language devices, certainly to begin with, until you build your confidence. It's all about effect. AO2 is all about what the reader thinks or feels. And the question you need to ask yourself is, how does the writer's use of X, whether it's a word, a phrase, a device, whatever, how does the writer's use of language in this part of the text make you feel, or what does it make you think? This is something that some of my students tend to struggle with. In particular, if you read something and you think to yourself, I have no feelings when I read this. This doesn't make me think of anything. And if that sounds familiar to you, if that's a feeling that you get quite often when you're reading and the teacher's asking you to say, well, what does it make you feel? If you don't feel anything, then it can be quite difficult to answer that question. I find that some students find it helpful to rephrase the question slightly as, what is it you think that the writer wants you to feel here? Because regardless of whether or not you think it was successful, one way to look at AO2 is looking at what the writer intended when they put those words down on the page. So the intended effect, possibly, instead of the actual effect, if that's something that sounds familiar to you. If you are someone who is able to read text in a very emotional way and be able to respond in a very emotional way, if you're anything like me and you find it very easy to cry at a good book, then AO2 should be quite straightforward for you. But I realise that is not everyone, and it's something that a lot of students do struggle with. So if you find it useful, rephrase the question slightly to yourself. What is the intended effect? What do I think the writer was hoping most readers would think or feel here? And then the big part of AO2 is using the relevant subject terminology, or calling things by their proper names, using English-specific terms, so using the right word class when you're writing about the effect of a specific word. What's the effect of that specific adjective or noun or verb, for example? And also your list of literary devices, which by now you should have been practicing since kind of year 7 and on. Similes, metaphors, alliteration, onomatopoeia, all of those English-specific terms that you will have been practicing and learning from very, very early on, that's where they come in handy here. But the thing to remember is that, yes, you do need to demonstrate a good understanding of this subject terminology, but this question is not a feature spotting exercise, okay? Absolutely not. There are almost no marks available for just listing all of the nouns that you find in the text, or all of the adjectives, or all of the metaphors and similes. The marks actually come from the link that you make between the subject terminology and the effect it creates. The exam board are interested to see that you are recognising patterns in the English language and you're recognising the methods the writer uses, but they are not interested in you just showing off how many terms you have learned off by heart and how many you can regurgitate in 10 minutes. So just be careful with this one, because this is a mistake that a lot of people make when they first start having a go at question 2, is they see that line in the mark scheme about subject terminology and they just go for it, and they really focus just on that as one particular feature. But as you can see from this breakdown of AO2, it is just one skill within a skill. And as I've said already, the thing that AQA are particularly interested in are the links between the effects and the terminology. So word, effect, language device, effect. Always come back to effect wherever you can. So I'm going to go through some tips now for approaching question 2 in the first instance. And the first thing to do is to find the lines that you've been asked to focus on and to draw a box around them. Just like with question 1, the exam paper will direct you to specific lines from the extract and ask you to comment on a particular thing within those lines. And just like in question 1, any comments that you make that fall outside those lines, unfortunately, no matter how good they are not worth any marks. There is nothing more disheartening than coming to midway through or even finishing your answer and realising that you have quoted from the wrong lines, or that you've used information that you found in a different part of the text. And with only 10 minutes to spare on this particular question, you don't really have time to go back and finally edit and fine-tune your answer. So just drawing a box around those lines will focus your reading. It will stop your eyes from wandering up or down the page and just keep your eyes focused on what is relevant. It is worth letting you know that in the exam paper, AQA do reproduce the named lines just above question 2, so you will have them right there above the question to make sure that you are looking in the right place. However, if you have been using the active reading method that I talked about in my previous video, you've already highlighted a bunch of really useful stuff in your extract, and it'd be such a shame either for that to go to waste or for you to have to waste time copying it over to your exam booklet. So I would recommend having both. You may wish to annotate a completely fresh copy if you're wishing to approach it with completely fresh eyes, or perhaps you didn't annotate much in that particular section, therefore you're not doubling up on work. You can just focus on those lines for question 2. However, if you have got things that are already highlighted and labelled and you've got some brilliant stuff to use, it would be such a shame not to use it. So draw a box and just have the extract next to you while you're answering question 2, and it saves you from having to double up. And if you have got things highlighted already, make sure that you use them. There is a reason that those words and phrases jumped out at you. There's a reason your eye was drawn to them, or that your mind mulled over those particular devices again and again. And now is the time to start thinking about, okay, I said that was interesting. Now, why do I find that interesting? Look at the focus of the question. Does it help to describe that character that I'm being asked to investigate a bit more? Yes, it tells me something quite crucial about them. That's what I'm going to use. And it's a shortcut, isn't it? Because you've already read it, you've already had a look at meaning, and there's no point in doing that all over again if you've got some fantastic ideas that you can use already. this would be a good time as well to start labelling any correct terminology. So again, remember, it's not feature spotting, but if you know there's a quote you're going to use, it would be worth your while now thinking about, well, I find that particular word interesting. I need to make sure that I am labelling it correctly. So is it a noun? Does it name something? Is it an adjective? Is it describing? Is it a verb? Is it an action? And being able to use that key terminology in your answer, especially anytime you use the word, being able to just substitute that for the word class, just demonstrates a little bit more confidence with your use of subject terminology. But again, we'll look at some example answers in a little while, which show you what that looks like in terms of an answer in a bit. So here is an example question 2 based on the extract from Rebecca, which is what I had a look at in the video that walks through reading an unseen extract. So if you haven't already watched that, it might be worth your while just pausing this video, having a look at that and having a good read of the Rebecca extract, and then coming back, because you may find that it's more useful to go into question 2 with a little bit of background knowledge of the extract. So question 2 asks you to look in detail at this extract from lines 14 to 28 of the source. How does the writer use language here to describe the driveway to the house? You could include the writer's choice of words and phrases, language features and techniques, and sentence forms, and that is all worth 8 marks. The bits I'm just highlighting in the question here are going to be the same for every question 2. It will always give you some suggestions as to what to look for. And really, when it says you could include, it's not really optional, it's kind of telling you this is what you need to write about. But try not to worry about that too much, because like I say, question 2 is a fairly instinctive question, and it's one that you're very well prepared for throughout secondary school, so it shouldn't really be anything wildly different to what you do already. In a moment, I'm going to suggest that you have a go at answering your question 2. And when you do that, I would suggest that you time yourself, give yourself the 10 minutes to answer, and be disciplined. Don't spend more than 10 minutes. When that timer goes off, put your pen down and stop. If you are desperate to keep on going, change the pen so you can see the difference between what you've done in 10 minutes and what you have done with more time. Later on in this video, I'm going to go through quite an easy way that you can use to self-assess. And you'll be able to see what impact the extra time actually has on your answer. And for most people, I find that actually spending more time on question 2 doesn't necessarily equal more marks. So what I recommend you do now is to pause the video and have a go at question 2. If you don't feel quite ready to dive straight in and you feel like you need a little bit more support before you get started with tackling this question, then take a look at the short video that I've done where I go back to the extract and I annotate it in more detail, looking at just question 2 features. You might find that that helps target your answer a little bit more. But if you feel like you're ready to give this a go, or if you're just doing this as a practice, pause the video now, time yourself for 10 minutes, then come back and we'll look at some example answers and look at marking the questions together. Okay, so you've had a go at question 2. Hopefully it wasn't too difficult. Maybe you had a look at the annotation video in a bit more detail before you had a go, or maybe you had a go on your own. It doesn't really matter which way round you've done it. You can still take part in this bit of the video. So this is the mark scheme for question 2. It's a generic mark scheme. It's not one of the specific ones from a particular paper, because there's no indicative content given as to what I'm looking for each level. But I am just going to talk for a minute about the levels in the mark scheme. So quite often students will ask me what grade a question is, and you cannot give a grade to a single question 2 on its own, because it's only 8 marks out of 80. You can't give a grade based on 10% of a paper. What you can give, though, is a level in terms of how strong an answer is. And this is exactly what exam markers do, is when they are marking a piece, they will look at the level of answer it is first and then decide how many marks, because they decide whether it is at the top or the bottom of the level. And you'll see that for question 2, there's only 2 marks in it per level. So being at the top or bottom of a level is essentially the difference of a single mark either way. And the language that's used to describe each level of the mark scheme tells you a little bit about the strength of the answer. So for level 1, you're looking for simple, unlimited comments. Level 2, you're looking for some understanding. And then moving into the two top levels, level 3 is a clear answer, clear and relevant. And then level 4 is those really impressive 8 out of 8 and 7 out of 8 mark answers, which are the detailed and perceptive analysis answers. So what I'm going to show you now is 3 example answers. So obviously there's a lot of text here and I'm not going to read each answer to you right now. So just pause the video and have a careful read of each of these example answers and decide for yourself which you think is the best, which you think is the weakest answer, and which one you think is somewhere in between. So pause the video, read those example answers carefully and have a think about what order they go in terms of marks. Challenge yourself as well to be able to say why you think it is top, middle or bottom. Okay, pause the video and have a read. Okay, so I can now reveal, drum roll please, the highest marks was student C. In the middle we had student A, and then the weakest answer of the 3 was student B. So let's look at each answer individually and look at why they got those particular answers. So starting back at the mark scheme, in order to apply this mark scheme, one way that I find is really helpful to guide your self-assessment, which you can do this in a much speeded up version, obviously, in the exam, but certainly when it comes to practice questions, this is a really good way of assessing what level you are at and how close you are to the next level up, and that is simply through a colour-coded system. So you'll notice that AO2 is split into 3 sub-skills, and you'll see I've just highlighted all of the top bullet points for each level in pink there, because it's looking at the same thing. So pink is any comments on the effect of the language. So anything where the students are commenting on what the language makes the reader think or feel, that's what I'm going to be looking for and highlighting in pink. Any evidence, any quotation is yellow. That's quite simple and quite straightforward. A big part of AO2 is linking the effects to textual detail, or otherwise known as quotes or references. And then the final point is subject terminology, and I've highlighted that in blue. So all I'm going to do now is apply this colour-coded system to each example answer, and you should be able to tell either from the amount of each colour or from the types of comments that appear under the colours what level roughly the answer is. So let's take a look at student A and apply the mark scheme to student A. So this student has written, "The writer has made the driveway appear to be taken over by nature. The writer uses personification to describe the tree's naked limbs and branches intermingled in a strange embrace. This draws the reader into the scene, describing it in detail. The writer has also described how the grass and moss has choked the gravel surface of the driveway, showing that the drive is overgrown and not able to show through. The writer also emphasises how abandoned the driveway is by saying no hand had checked their progress, implying that no one has been down the driveway for some time." Okay, so it's not a terrible answer, it's not an award-winning answer either. And the reasons for that are as follows. So in pink here, I've just highlighted some of the key terms that signpost to the examiner the effect that this student is trying to write about. So words like emphasise, imply, and commenting on how it draws the reader in, those are the comments on the effect of the language. And all of those comments they're probably just into level 3. They are quite clear. There's nothing particularly ambiguous about what they're saying, and everything they're saying is factually correct. To get level 3 or above, it has to be correct. So your inferences have to be logical, they have to make sense, and they have to be very carefully supported. And that's definitely the case with student A here. So in particular, the bit at the bottom where they're writing about how the writer emphasises how abandoned it is and then saying what that implies, that is a particularly clear comment down there. In terms of evidence, they've used quite a lot of quotation, and again, that would get it into level 3, because it's a range of relevant textual details. Again, the key word there is relevant, so you cannot get level 3 for using evidence if you're using loads of quotes indiscriminately. The quotes you use have to be relevant to the points you are making, and they have to back up what it is you're saying. Now, what about subject terminology? There's not a lot going on there. So personification, it is correct, but it is level 2 because there's not that much of it. They haven't really unpicked how the personification draws the reader in. They've just said, here is some personification that I've labelled, here is an effect. I haven't really linked the two things together, and you'll notice as well they haven't really explained what they mean by drawing the reader in. So that makes that entire comment not quite clear. It's still a little bit ambiguous. The examiner's still going to be sitting there going, yeah, that's correct, but can you tell me a little bit more? So put that all together, that puts this answer at a low level 3. So it gets into level 3, but only just, giving this a mark of 5 out of 8. So what is actually wrong with this answer? What could they have done to make it better? I will just say, it's not a terrible answer at all. It's actually fairly good, but we're being critical because we want to know how we can improve. So starting off with the comments on effect, some of the statements here are a little bit fluffy, a bit woolly. Statements like draws the reader in or makes you want to read on, they don't actually say anything about the effect of the writer's language. It's a kind of filler statement that a lot of people learn somewhere in primary school, and it stays with them because they know they have to say something about the effects of language. But actually those fluffy statements, what they show is that you haven't really fully understood the effect on the reader of the personification or the quotes that you have selected in that particular section of your answer. Now this answer is saved by its much clearer analysis towards the bottom. The emphasis in implying is much clearer. So it's not the end of the world, and this student clearly does understand the effects of language. This is a typical sort of thing I would see from a person who is rushing a little bit, or maybe someone who is panicking a little bit in an exam, which is of course understandable. And then when it comes to evidence, although they have used a range of quotes, they've not been particularly judicious. They have, however, been embedded really well into their sentences, so they've used the quotes to finish and make up parts of their sentence, but they haven't got as much mileage out of each quote as maybe they could have. So always try to say a lot about a little if you can, and that shows that you're being really, really picky with the evidence that you're selecting, and you're not just indiscriminately copying quotes down. The weakest part of this answer is the lack of terminology. It is almost fully clear, but it must meet all of the skills descriptors to get at the top of that level. Now, I will say this is probably being very, very picky, because the fact that they have mentioned that how the language is describing things in detail, so describe there, would potentially boost the marks just a little bit, but in my opinion still not quite enough to push it over into a level 3 response, a top level of level 3 that is. So for those reasons it keeps its mark of 5 out of 8. So looking at student B, this was the one that we said was the weakest of the 3 responses. The writer uses a range of language to describe the driveway to the house. The driveway is made to seem scary and overgrown. I know this because it repeats the word trees over and over again. The writer does this to show that there are a lot of trees and to draw the reader's attention to how many there are. The writer also says the trees had thrown out low branches, making an impediment to progress. The gnarled roots look like skeleton claws, which is really effective because it shows a lot of detail. The writer has said about there being a lot of plants in the way, grass and moss. This means there are a lot of plants growing in the driveway. Okay, so first of all, let's look at the effects on the reader. Made to seem, show, and draws readers' attention. These are all fairly simplistic comments. There's no real sense that this student has interpreted or rephrased their understanding. They are simply parroting what is said. They're saying, for example, that the writer has used the word trees over and over. This tells me there are lots of trees. That doesn't actually comment at all on effect. It's simply restating what you've already said in a quote. And then let's look at the evidence they've used. Simple textual detail, and that's mainly shown by the fact that not all of the quotes are as embedded as they could be, and they have quoted fairly indiscriminately here. So I've just realised some of my highlighting has gone a bit squiffy over here and has moved a little bit. Hopefully you can kind of see where it all matches up though. And then when it comes to terminology, it has only really used the word word. So all of that together puts this at a level 1 response. It's very simple. It doesn't really get into deeper attempts or some, which is the key word for level 2, and it's certainly not clear. The points they have made are all valid and they are relevant, but they are very simple. There's nothing much more to them than what's written down. And because of that, it gets top level of level 1, which keeps it at 2 out of 8. What could they have done to improve it? So this is another very fluffy answer. So things like draws the reader's attention is essentially saying the same thing as drawing the reader in. Although this is quite a long answer, so this is the mistake that a lot of people make, is they think they have to write a lot to get the marks. This student actually could have achieved the same amount of marks in maybe about a quarter of the words. So even though it's very wordy, the student probably put in a lot of effort into this writing, it doesn't actually say anything about the effects of language. So this is someone who hasn't fundamentally understood the skills required from question 2. And possibly someone who's not very confident in drawing inferences and simply wants to reiterate what they understand in terms of factual recall. So if this had been an AO1 question, it might have been slightly different marks. They have used quotes, but like I said earlier, they're pretty much copied and pasted. There's a very long one in there which tends to show that the student is not being particularly judicious. They're not zooming in on specifics, they're just taking out whole lines and drawing very general conclusions about it. And it doesn't really show a selective understanding of writers' choices. There's very little subject terminology as well, just a very basic focus on the writer's method through that word. So overall, 2 out of 8. And then on to student C. Du Maurier uses an extended metaphor of personification to create an image for the reader of a driveway being choked slowly in a stealthy and insidious way by natural overgrowth. The overall impression the reader gets is of a once well-tended garden path with things of culture and grace grown to impress, slowly taken over due to long neglect and desolation. Du Maurier immediately evokes feelings of discomfort towards nature from the reader, portraying it as having an almost human-like intelligence. By using the adjectives stealthy and insidious, Du Maurier is establishing that nature, further personified through the use of the proper noun and pronoun her, is a malevolent force upon the driveway. This is further emphasised through Du Maurier's use of dynamic verbs choked, thrust and straggled. These all add to a sense of movement and life juxtaposed against a man-made gravel drive, now a thread of its former self. The impression gained by the reader is that of a reversal of roles. Rather than the house and drive imposing itself upon nature as might be expected, Du Maurier makes it clear that the nature surrounding the drive is, in fact, sentient and in control. Wow, that is an absolutely incredible answer. It's way above what you need to be replicating for GCSE. So let's take a look at what makes it such a strong answer. So first of all, you can see how much pink we have already, and this is probably not everything that's going on. Look at the language that they are using to comment on the effect on the reader. Things like impressions, evoking feelings, establishing ideas, emphasising, creating a sense of movement, and again, that idea of impressions. Quite a high level of vocabulary coming from this student, and certainly a high level of understanding. These comments are definitely securely into level 4. They are analysing the effects of writer's choice of language. They're not just stating these are the effects, they're starting to say how those effects are created. And again, if you look at the yellow, you can see that not only have they used a lot of references, but they are all very carefully embedded into sentences. So wherever they can, this student has used Du Maurier's words rather than their own as a shortcut to getting those quotations in. But whenever they've done that, they have also linked it to effect. So you can see everywhere there's yellow, very, very close to it, there's some pink, which shows you that they are linking the two things very, very carefully. And then a really impressive strength of this answer is the quite high-level terminology that they are using. So things like extended metaphor, personification, adjectives, pronoun, proper noun, dynamic verb, juxtaposition. They've got lots and lots in there. And this is a student who clearly knows their stuff. It's sophisticated and it's highly accurate use of subject terminology. So it will not surprise you, or hopefully won't surprise you, to know that this student would have achieved 8 out of 8. The reason I've used this example, though, is to show you exactly what I meant earlier about how it's easy to spend too long on this question. This student has probably done more than they need to do for 8 marks. If you're achieving this kind of writing in 10 minutes, that is absolutely fantastic. However, this is the kind of writing that could take some students half an hour, even more, to write. It's not to say they're not capable of that level of detail, but whether or not you can do it in 10 minutes is another matter. You can practice, and with practice you do get faster, but if you know you are someone who can write incredibly in-depth answers if you have been given more time, then it's even more important for you to be disciplined with the timings on this exam paper, because as beautiful as the answer is, if they've spent more than 10 minutes on it, that is time they now don't have for another question. So just be very wary of that. And what makes this answer so good? You can see just from the balance of the colours, there's a nice spread of all 3 skills from assessment objective 2. There's a clear and critical response to the question. They've actually thought about what exactly their impression of the driveway is and how that impression was created. They've also started looking at some of the bigger ideas like themes, and although this is a language focus, there is a sense that they have also understood structure, and they can see how the whole thing feeds together. As I said before, the use of evidence is impressive because it's embedded throughout, and it demonstrates a really perceptive and subtle manipulation of the writer's word choices. So it's a really nice way of showing that you understand every single word that the writer has used by using them in your own way. And like I said earlier as well, they clearly know their stuff when it comes to terminology. It's very, very confident. There's a very ambitious range that's being used, and it's being used correctly. And importantly, it hasn't been used as just a feature spotting activity. Again, you can see the proximity of the colours to each other. Every time there's yellow, there's also blue near it, and then some pink. So the 3 things are very closely linked. It would worry me a little bit if there was a lot of one colour clustered in one part of the answer, particularly if that colour was the colour you're using for terminology, because that would suggest someone who's listing rather than interpreting and understanding. So, using the same principles, why don't you have a go at marking your own answer? It's really important to be honest about what you have and haven't achieved here. Use the colour-coded mark scheme to help you spot the balance. You can get the mark scheme from the AQA website, print it off and highlight it if you prefer using a physical paper copy. If not, you can use the pink, yellow and blue system that I used in my video. Give yourself a mark out of 8, and from that give yourself a target. And it's really important that you then do something with that. So don't just go away, mark it and go, okay, I got 4 out of 8. Brilliant, move on. Make sure that you have a go at more practice questions. The more often you do this, the quicker and better you will get. If you do very well, then it's worth considering what it is that went well about this particular question. And again, practice it again and make sure that you're not just doing it as a one-off fluke, that you can do it reliably under time conditions in an exam. So thanks for listening. It was a longer and much more in-depth video this time than previously. If this was useful for you, then let me know by tweeting me at CollinsKEnglish, and stay tuned for the next series of videos which will be going through questions 3 and 4 in section A, question 5 for section B, and then eventually, when I have some time, I'll put together a set of videos on English Language Paper 2 as well. Keep the questions coming, keep the feedback coming, and good luck with your revision. Thanks very much. Bye.